In our lecture of Veblen, I admittedly spend a great deal of time talking about him because, for me, he's among my favorites. And there's several reasons why. And if anything, I get a sense, even as I just kind of assess who I am as an economist, I get this sense that, you know, I'm I'm very much a Veblen as I kind of assess myself. So Veblen, Thorstein Veblen, and maybe part of the reason why I like him is I was also born in Wisconsin, much like our Veblen here. He was born in northern Wisconsin, and big family. He went to Carleton College in Minnesota in 1874. His work began in philosophy, and then he went to do graduate work in philosophy at Johns Hopkins, which was one of the first kind of graduate schools we had here in the United States. And Johns Hopkins wouldn't have been that old of a school at the time, but then he dropped out. He transferred to Yale, and finished up his PhD. And one of the things that was interesting about him is that whereas most philosophy departments at the time were really religiously oriented, Veblen himself was not that religious. And in fact, he was quite critical of religion. And the net result of that was that it was difficult for him to find a job in academia, in the university. And at the time, most universities also had some sort of religious connection. So it was just hard for him to find a job. So he gets his PhD from Yale, and he ends up having to return back to Minnesota, and he lives in some pretty abject poverty for quite a bit of time in Minnesota. But the thing that he does do is he marries Ellen Rolfe, and he then continues some of his graduate work at Cornell. And it turns out that he gets a pretty close working relationship with Lawrence Laughlin. And Lawrence Laughlin becomes important because in about 20 years later, he's going to help create the Federal Reserve as a monetarist. And Laughlin brings Veblen with him to the newly created University of Chicago, which was formed with some money that they'd gotten from the Rockefeller Foundation. So this gets Veblen the kind of authority, and so he kind of borrows the authority from Laughlin to start being able to publish things on his own and start teaching at the University of Chicago. His most important work, all conducted there at University of Chicago between 1892 and 1906. 1906, he goes to the newly created school of Stanford and gets kicked out of Stanford because he was sleeping around. He was a friend of the ladies, I guess you could say. So he gets kicked out of Stanford as a professor. He was dating his students, dating other faculty members' wives. Gets kicked out of Stanford, and then basically just kind of goes to the University of Missouri for a little bit, just to kind of pay the bills, and then finally ends up at the New School for Social Research, which is in New York City. And New School for Social Research is kind of the place where you go where people acknowledge that you're pretty smart, but there's no university that's willing to take you on. This school will become important after World War II, because when European academics, primarily Jews, are being kicked out of European universities as Hitler takes over, schools in the United States were also pretty anti-Semitic, and the New School was one of the few places that took on Jewish scholars. Yeah, what do you say? He liked the ladies. It's hard to talk about Veblen without talking about this, because he could have had, the reason why I include it is that he could have had such a greater level of influence in the discipline had he been able to stay at Stanford longer. But again, he got kicked out. Even when he was at Chicago, he got kicked out of Chicago because he had taken a tour of Europe with another man's wife. So he gets kicked out of Chicago, he gets University of Chicago, gets kicked out of Stanford, all because he's sleeping around. And he wasn't very good at cheating either. Not that that should be our measure here, but Dorfman, who's his biographer, does a pretty good biography of Veblen. I've read it, and essentially Veblen's wife was pretty upset about these affairs because he didn't hide it well, and he would have all these letters from his admirers, in his pockets and whatnot. And he was a terrible lecturer. There's this funny story that you used to in the day, when students would come to class, they would give you a ticket, right? And then the professor would turn in those tickets at the end of a week into the business office at a college so that they could get paid. And when he died, they just found boxes and boxes of these tickets that he had never redeemed to get paid. He also just didn't believe a great deal in grades, and he would change grades all around because he didn't really think a great deal about how ideas translate into grades. Yeah, his lectures were horrible. Didn't use a typewriter. Didn't like using the telephone. Didn't like cleaning. Didn't like office hours. He didn't like students, and students didn't like him. So he would not be winning any Professor of the Year awards. Interestingly enough, I did some archival research on the economist Homer Jones, who actually was a student. Let me pause here. So what I was saying was that Homer Jones was a student of Veblen at the University of Chicago, and Homer Jones would later go on to lead the St. Louis Federal Reserve. He's, again, one of the early monetarists, but he actually had Homer Jones, in his archival papers, had all the handwritten notes from when Veblen was lecturing. And all I can say is that there wasn't much content there. Didn't look like he was teaching a great deal, and it looks like, most likely, even Homer Jones had to teach himself the economics. So I guess Veblen wasn't that great, at least in the classroom. But what he did do well was he was an intellectual's intellectual. He was widely read, and he could just obsessively focus on reading and writing. And he didn't form these tight relations with other faculty members or other individuals. So he was largely disconnected, and that just gave him the ability to just really consume himself with the work that he was doing. So what emerges out of Veblen is this tradition of historicism. And so in historicism, what we're talking about is an idea that economics, like any other discipline, can't be separated from history. And so we can understand change by understanding history. And that what we see in history is social dynamics, things changing through a process. Okay, so that's where Veblen's like Marx, is that economic institutions are evolving. And Veblen, like Marx, is building off of historicism. But the difference comes from the fact that whereas Marx's notion of historicism was German historicism, which was a bit more deterministic, Veblen's notion of historicism was British, and British historicism relied on the work of Darwin and Spencer, which meant that with biological evolution, which is what British historicism relies on, it's not so deterministic. It's not as predictable as Marx makes it seem. Right? For Marx, he talks about this evolution of society from an agrarian society all the way out to communism, right? And that it has to follow these steps. For Veblen, that's not the case. Society is evolving, but it's not as predictable as Marx makes it seem. And the way that this change is occurring is through habits. That there are institutions in society where we can try to understand this change, and that there are habits that people engage in that allow for some level of predictability. Habits allow people to go through their daily life without a great deal of thought, and it's a shortcut, right? So habits are basically a shortcut to getting through the world, and that the activity that people organize their lives so much around is the two very basic tasks of getting food and shelter. And that means that our minds, our actions, many of them are all oriented around doing those two things, obtaining food and obtaining shelter. So, with that said, that activity of obtaining food and obtaining shelter, which are economic activities at their true essence, that's going to control and shape how communities form, and how, and this is important, how institutions form. Because these institutions are basically the embodiment of habits. Institutions are the way that we make explicit the habits that we do to getting the basics of food and shelter. So Veblen becomes known as a institutionalist, where the world can be viewed through these institutions. What the economist then does is they look at how these institutions are evolving over time. And that would mean that they're looking at three kinds of questions. How did the institutions start? How did they change over time? And as a consequence, what is it that, by them existing, what is it that they are, what kind of results do we get as a consequence of having such institutions? By doing these things, by understanding the way that these institutions evolve over time, then what we are able to do is we're able to understand the underlying structure in the society. And that structure, again, provides us these shortcuts for the way that things are organized. And, as the last bullet point highlights, it gives us the ability to start to try to think about how to predict what will happen in the future and how we think those institutions will change. Veblen also relies on this idea of instincts and that um, instincts are evolve, and they're also incorporated within institutions. And the instincts that Veblen talks about are of two types. We have the constructive instincts, and in the constructive instinct, we're talking about like this, this idea that like parents care for their kids because they want their kids to continue to live, right? And that humans in general want to be efficient in their work, and that that there's a curiosity, there's an innate curiosity in the human being. If we take all these constructive instincts together, what we can understand are the technological and, it's what Veblen calls ceremonial institutions. So, as a technological institution, we'd be talking about things like, production methods and other inventions that make the production of goods more efficient. When we're talking about the educational system as a instinct, as part of a constructive instinct, it would be education where I learn skills that make me, for instance, a better worker or a more efficient worker. These things, these ceremonial institutions and technological progress, give us a system of laws, for instance, where we have property rights. It gives us a well-ordered and organized financial system, all things that make the production process more efficient. But then what we also have, besides constructive instincts, are predatory instincts. And in these predatory instincts, what we're seeing is that there's this tendency for things to become bigger. That we see individuals wanting to acquire more and more stuff. That there's an attempt to get something for nothing. And, like a predator, right, we can think of it that someone is trying to gain something by harming somebody else, right? And Veblen takes this back all the way to this notion of warrior and hunter. So we have economic structures organized around these constructive instincts and these predatory instincts. And there's a counter to them. Right? There's a conflict between them. The constructive instincts are ones where we would have more cooperation, right? That's how you get production occurring, through this cooperation among workers in a teamwork setting, a cooperative nature between workers and machines. But then the predatory instincts are exactly the opposite, right? And that would be one where you don't want to be kind, you want to win. So what institutions need to do is they need to control the conflict that exists between these two types of instincts. And these institutions that control the instincts, what we get from there are, again, the technological institutions that are part of the constructive instincts. Again, that would be, like a production process and whatnot. And then we get our ceremonial institutions that are part of our predatory instincts, right? So we could imagine, like in capitalism, for instance, right? Get bigger or, get bought out by somebody else. Or we could imagine, a country going to war with another country, or a religion saying that they're holier than some other country, or religion. Or even in higher education, where we talk about how some school is ranked higher than some other school. The broader society is organized around technological institutions and ceremonial institutions coexisting in the same society. The ceremonial institutions are static over time, but the constructive instincts and the technological institutions that are designed around them need to be dynamic. There is change, right? There is destructive change, as Schumpeter would call it. It's the technological institutions where we see this change. I mean, dude, look around today, right? That's how we see this change all being proposed about taking on AI and how the entire society will change as we take on greater levels of AI. And so, at University of Chicago, Veblen writes 2 books. The one becomes really popular, The Theory of the Leisure Class, in 1899, and then just a few years later, he writes The Theory of Business Enterprise. So these 2 works are the ones that are going to give us kind of an idea of Veblen's views on the world. When we look at The Theory of the Leisure Class, Veblen is looking at this idea of people again wanting to have an efficient marketplace, and that workers have a desire to be productive and provide things that people actually appreciate. And at the same time, as they have this pride in the work that they're doing and that they want to produce things, they also want to be better than their competitors, right? So they're a bit predatory. And, right, as they try to do that, as they try to be better than somebody else, what you need to do is you need to show others that you're better than somebody else. So how do you do that? What you would have to do is have some conspicuous consumption, right? You would need to show your wealth to others as a way to show that you are more powerful, right? So, as we say in the last bullet point here, you would show people that you have property, right? That you have like a really big house, a really fancy car, or you would describe to people a life where you're not actually working, right? Where you're just like sitting on a yacht or whatever and just kind of living life and enjoying it, right? Kind of like a Kardashian, I guess. I'm not really sure what the Kardashians do. But a Kardashian is a perfect example of conspicuous consumption here in both cases. How do you show, again, you could show this by like, how would you show that you don't have to work? Well, you can do it in social media, for instance, right? You could show yourself at various clubs, or just like sitting in the middle of a work day, and you're just sitting out and relaxing, or you'd have some prestige, or you would just do things that just seem really weird and really odd, which is what the leisure class does, and what we could call conspicuous waste. I'm not from Hawaii originally, but I certainly see this in Hawaii. In the Midwest, where I'm originally from, it just doesn't happen as much as it happens here in Hawaii. At least my take of it. And that conspicuous consumption that exists by the leisure class is a wasted resource. It's a waste of a scarce resource, that you're just doing things just to show that you're more powerful or that you're better than someone else, right? Where's the productive value in that? It goes counter to these instincts of how humans exist. And the leisure class, again, then has this conflict where the people in the leisure class, they have to show that they're enjoying leisure, But then at the same time, they have to do things that show that they're productive, right? And so then that's why you get, wives and daughters that do certain jobs that show that the family as a whole can enjoy leisure, but then the husband goes off to work and earns the money, right? And the man's this is gendered obviously, but that the man, that the way that they show that they are relaxing and have leisure is by having a beautiful wife and daughter, and that the wives, daughters, the children are these sorts of ornaments that show just how well off they are. And that this leisure class grows. This leisure class grows, starts at the highest class within the individuals, and then works its way down. Such that even among lower classes, they have to emulate upper class waste, meaning that lower class people, middle class, even lower class people, end up, for instance, like say, leasing a car rather than buying a car, right? And we see that, right? We can look out in the world and we can see, really fancy cars. And I don't know, probably 20 years ago, it meant that the person had a lot of money because they could buy, I don't know, a BMW or a Mercedes-Benz. Today, all it means is that they've got the $800 a month or so to lease the vehicle for 3 years, right? And they're showing off that they've got all this wealth, but it's wasteful because they actually don't even have all that wealth that they say that they're having. And so it's irrational, at least for Veblen. Veblen sees that the instinct is irrational, and then it leads to irrational social institutions that perpetuate these instincts. And that again, that the lower class, the lower classes, they're not going to say, no, we shouldn't be judged by the kind of car we drive. Rather, they're going to say, well, how is it that I can get that kind of car so that I can look like I'm wealthy, even if I'm really not? Now, the second text that Veblen writes is called The Theory of Business Enterprise. And this is happening at a time when businesses are becoming really, really, really big. As the last bullet point highlights, this is the first Gilded Age. So you see these individuals that are kind of like stealing from others, these robber barons. And he thought Veblen, as a person, Veblen was looking at this, and he saw that the firm, or the business enterprise, was a really important institution in the modern society. But whereas some focus on this idea of how the industrialization is present and that it carries it forward, what he was really interested in is, why is the firm in this level of industrialization happening right now, right? And how is it going to look different in the future? So I'll just skip this here. It was just me kind of picking on some of the bigger robber barons here. Jay Gould, Cornelius Vanderbilt, and whatnot. That for Veblen, the industrial economy that was currently existing at the turn of the 20th century was that you had two kinds of things going on. One where individuals were, in a skilled profession where they were actually producing things primarily with their hands, right? So you would have, for instance, an engineer, a farmer, someone working on a railroad, these kinds of things. And then besides the machine process, you had the business enterprise within the industrial economy. And in the business enterprise, the concern wasn't to make a useful good, Rather, the concern was how to make more money. So these are going to be individuals like stockbrokers, accountants, bankers, salesmen, where it's just more sales, or how do I make more money by doing something else? The occupations that are involved in the productive, in the machine process, would be ones where these individuals who use their kind of broad skills, their craftsmanship to produce the things that they're producing, they rely on the businessmen, right, for the jobs or the things that they do. But even though they rely on the businessmen for the jobs that they do, the businessmen don't care about the craftsmanship of the worker, right? They just want to make a lot of money, right? And they're going to get a lot of money not by allowing the people to be craftsmen. Rather, it's just going to be all about skilled production. So business has an incentive to destroy the craftsman, right? To make the production process even more and more efficient to get things done. And so we have this notion of sabotaging industry. And in that sabotaging of industry, we have businessmen that are pursuing efficiency. The quality suffers, it becomes more uniform, but again, it just becomes less artisanal, I guess would be another way of saying it. And that these businesses just want to become bigger and bigger and bigger. That they're seeking to find a greater deal of monopolistic profit, and that they get those higher prices by reducing how much they're producing, right? And the businessman concerned about profit is going to just focus on making more money, which again destroys any notion of being able to craft things in a particular way with quality. He has a chapter on, for instance, on loan credit. And he actually Veblen makes a connection between financial credit and how this financial credit basically exists to allow companies to even get larger and larger. And that there's not a great deal of productivity that's attached to being able to borrow money for various things. As Veblen says, cash loans afford the borrower a differential advantage in bidding against other businessmen for the control and uses of the industrial processes. They afford him a differential advantage in the distribution of the material means of industry, but they constitute no aggregate addition to the material means of industry at large. They serve the distribution of the control of industry only, not its materially productive work. What does that mean? It basically, again, means is that if someone's lending you money, they're doing it only to make more money, not to spread, the distribution of high-quality artisanal products, or just to even make more products as a whole. Veblen had a great deal of respect and esteem for technicians and engineers. In this emerging economy that comes out in the 20th century, he believed that technicians and engineers had this unique knowledge set that would allow them to create and manage machines that would keep products being produced that reflect craftsmanship. And he believed that instead of allowing machines to be under the control of businessmen, that what we should do is we should have the capital and labor and the processes where they're combined be managed by technicians and engineers. And so then we get this conflict then, right? You get this conflict between the engineers that know how the process works and the businessman who is the one that's basically paying for the machines and only cares about making more and more money, right? And so how do you deal with that conflict that exists between the two? That the engineer and the technologist, they're going to want to make the process more efficient. They're going to look for ways to produce things better. They're not going to necessarily care about who owns what, right? They just want a better process. And this innovation isn't always designed around how to make more money. When I saw the movie The Social Network for the first time, this is exactly the kinds of things I was thinking about, right? We're talking about like Mark Zuckerberg, the early years, right? Where, as a person, he really liked to, create code and design, design software and whatnot, or, websites and whatnot. But if you remember, he had that like earlier example where he designed some like music sharing thing or course mashup or something, and he gave it away for free. But then Facebook represented the time when he finally transitioned from just being an engineer controlling the machines to trying to make money off of it. And that was kind of his transition as being a different person. Veblen would have been so proud of him. So then what Veblen has to do is he has to now understand that, with this kind of mindset, how do we understand what society will end up looking like? What concerned Veblen was this idea that capital was becoming quite concentrated, and that with this large amount of capital, you would have to have large companies to be able to afford all this capital that would exist. Right? It's kind of like, how does a small credit union compete with a big bank? They can't, right? So what's ended up happening, at least in the United States, right, is that big banks have become bigger and small banks have been consumed by the bigger banks. And so that leads Veblen to think that society basically has only one of two directions that it can go in. One where we get rid of that private property and we go to something like socialism, where you would have democratic institutions, and you kind of create, I don't know, like co-ops and whatnot, where you can still be, craftspeople, and you can have that workmanship. Or businesses run everything, right? So you'd have you would have a totalitarian system, right? And the businesses would run the society so that they could earn more money. And as a kind of a commentary on history, if you look back on this, that actually does fit pretty well. Nazi Germany. It's a little bit maybe overly deterministic what I'm about to say, but it does provide a pretty good explanation for why Germany, went to war in World War II. Yes, I mean, Hitler did have his kind of like personal beliefs about the world, but also, right, Nazi Germany was trying to, grow the economy so that they could get out of the long economic turmoil they had had since World War I. And Veblen is also critical of both Marxian economics as well as neoclassical economics. So while Veblen, as a historicist, I mean, he had a greater appreciation for the work of Marx compared to the other neoclassicals, the neoclassicals being like Jevons, Walras, Marshall. The biggest problem that Veblen had with the neoclassicals, they just didn't understand very well what it meant to be a human being. And Veblen, basically says that this notion of the rational economic actor or the rational economic man was outdated, and that it's inappropriate to just see people as doing things just seeking to maximize some function subject to a constraint. That again, instead, for Veblen, what you would want is that people are responding to their external environment and that they're acting out of habits in order to gain some advantage and be able to live longer and survive better than others. And that, as well, human beings both are affected by the environment and they affect the environment. And the rational economic man, the rational economic actor, view that exists for the neoclassicals just doesn't permit it. Now, if you wanted to look at this, again, this his critique, Veblen's critique of the neoclassicals and this idea that they maximize utility or happiness subject to some constraint, he makes that critique in the QJE, the Quarterly Journal of Economics, in an article entitled Why Economics is Not an Evolutionary Science. It's a pretty good read, actually, if you're thinking of giving it a read. I'm not going to read it. You can read this quote if you want to. The problem, as we get down to this a little bit further, the problem with the rational economic actor is that for the neoclassical, it's just assumed to exist in all places at all points in time. And that just can't be true. Is that really the universal nature across all cultures, all time periods, that people act in this kind of way? Veblen didn't think so. And Veblen was also suspicious of the idea that's put out by Clark that, you can treat wages and profits and rents and how they're distributed according to some, again, maximization subject to a constraint equation. He didn't buy it. He didn't think that the world had to exist in that kind of way. And so when he puts that all together, what he sees is a world that, at least for the neoclassicals, is one where there is no society, right? I mean, it's one without culture. It's one that is too technical, where people are just like machines or robots that are just, again, maximizing something subject to a constraint. And it's doesn't acknowledge the existence of these habits and these institutions that allow society to perhaps organize in one particular way and not another. It's just not realistic enough for Veblen. Is that for Veblen, the human being is a complicated individual shaped by institutions, and that these institutions exist for a particular point in time, for a particular culture, and that's not always going to be the case over a long period of time, that these institutions will get replaced by other institutions that seem more appropriate as time moves on. And these institutions and the human beings are all evolving in a Darwinian kind of way. As for Marx, which again, Veblen was a bit more sympathetic towards, the problem that Veblen had with Marx is that Veblen was not a Hegelian. Veblen was not a German historicist. And that means that for Veblen, society does not have to achieve a certain end goal, as it does for Marx, which is communism. And Veblen de-emphasizes this idea of the class structure or this class warfare. And, Veblen was a little bit more pessimistic. So even Marx is basically saying, in the long run, things will get better. That we should be optimistic about our future, right? Because eventually we'll get to this end goal of communism where everything will be better. And Veblen didn't necessarily see that being the case. That it wasn't necessarily the case that things go to something better or even necessarily something worse. It's just that it's changing. That's the important thing for Veblen. Okay, so Veblen is kind of one of the, Veblen, along with Clark, as being these kind of very first true American economists, set the stage for providing some of the first critiques then of the neoclassicals. Because remember, Marx is at the tail end of the classicals, and he's kind of this bridge between the classicals and the neoclassicals. The neoclassicals are starting to emerge as the dominant theory of economic thought, and Veblen is the first one to kind of say, this neoclassical economic thought has its problems as well. And one of the issues that Veblen does not bring out, but which will be brought out in the next chapter, would be, where's the macro? Where's the macroeconomics in neoclassical economics? There isn't any. And that's going to come out as we talk about Keynes in the next chapter.